Imagine you are at your home and you have several remotes for your electrical appliances. But now you want a new common remote that can turn on and off all of your appliances. But there's one catch. Each remote has its own specification and their own way to turn an appliance on or off. So our goal is to program this common remote, and it should have an undo button which reverts the action of the last button that you pressed. And the code should be extensible, maintainable, and all that jazz. Here comes the command pattern to save the day. This pattern consists of a command interface that has an execute and undo method. Next, we create concrete commands using this interface and implement the execute method to do some action. For example, turn on a fan, and the undo method to undo that action. For example, turn off that fan. Next, we have the receiver. These are the appliances that you have, for example, light, TV, console, etc. So the execute method of concrete command calls an action on the receiver. Next up, we have the client, which maps these concrete commands, because there can be multiple of them, to their receivers. In our case, this client is kind of a remote loader, which connects the concrete commands to the receivers and loads up the remote. And lastly, there is an invoker, which is in our case the common remote, the purpose of which is to make use of these commands to do some action. Here is a comprehensive class diagram for our common remote control. The remote is the invoker, light off and light on commands are the concrete commands, the light is the receiver, and remote loader is the client. Now let's see how it actually works in a program.
2 hours later.
Alright, this is my command interface. It has an execute and undo method. Now let's see some of the concrete commands. For example, the light on command implements this command interface. It has an instance of light in it and a string description. Next, we initialize this light instance in the constructor so that this command is bound to some receiver. So this light is a receiver, right? Let's look at the receiver class. So this is the light receiver class, and it has a method turn on. It just simply prints that light was turned on, or we can write our custom logic to turn on the light. And similarly, there is a turn off method. Then there is one method that sets the color of the light, and last method is it dims the light. So if we go back to our light on command, it implements that command interface but takes in an instance of light. So we are doing a composition of light with this light on command. And we override the execute and undo method of this light on command. So in the execute method, we turn on the light by calling the function of turn on the light instance. And in the undo, we just call the turn off method of that light instance. Similarly, we can implement the light off command. In the execute method, it will call turn off method, and in the undo, it will call turn on method. Let's look at some of the other receivers. For example, a fan. So fan has these methods here, which are low, medium, and high, and a separate method that turns off this fan named as off, and a get speed method which returns the current speed of the fan. Let's look at the command for this fan. So this is the fan on command. This is very similar to the light on command or other concrete commands. It has an instance of fan here. We are doing simple composition, and in the constructor we initialize this fan. This bounds a fan to this command. So this is binding or creation of this fan on command or any of the concrete commands will be done by the remote loader, which we'll see next. So similar to light, in the execute method we call the medium function. So it sets the speed of the fan to medium, and in the undo we turn off that fan. So as we are now familiar with the concrete commands and their receivers, so this is the remote class. It consists of an integer n, which denotes how many number of buttons are there on the remote. Next up, we have lists of on commands and off commands for these n buttons. And lastly, we have a command object which is named as undo command. So this will help us in keeping track of the last executed command and to perform the undo operation. So in this constructor, we initialize this n, we create an object of no command. This object is basically a concrete command which does nothing. So there is an empty execute function and empty undo function. So this no command is kind of a null but it's just type of a command, right? So we set the on commands and off commands list to no commands with the size of n, and we set the undo command as well to this. Next up, we have a set command function. So it basically sets a concrete command to a given slot. So here you can see we are setting the value of the slot index to a command which is passed as the parameter. Similarly for off commands. Next up, we have functions when a user performs some action on the remote. So when a user presses a button at a given slot, we just call the execute function of the element at index slot in the on commands, and we assign the undo command to it as well so that we can keep track of the last executed command, right? And similarly, we have an off button was pushed function. So this will be executed when a user presses an off button at the given slot. And lastly, we have the undo button was pushed function. So here that instance will be coming in handy. So this instance was storing the last executed command, and to undo the operation we can just call the undo function. And this is one helper function to display all of the commands that are there on the remote. Now let's check the remote loader. How do we create this remote and bind all the concrete commands with their receivers? So in the remote loader, we have a function. This can be a separate class even, but I just created this for simplicity. So first we prepare all our appliances. So we have objects of fan, light, and TV. Next, we create an object of remote with a slot size of 3. So there are 3 slots in this remote. And then we assign each slot on and off commands for each of these appliances. So for example, for slot 0, we have light on and off command, and we are passing that instance of light here so that it gets bound to each other. Similarly, for slot 1 and slot 2, we have fan and TV respectively. And lastly, we return this remote instance. Now let's do some experiments on this remote. So I'm getting the remote here. I am displaying the menu and I am pressing a bunch of buttons, and at the end I'm pressing the undo button. Let's see how this works and what is the output of this. So this is the output of this program. So first function that I executed was display menu. So this is the menu. At 0 there are light on and off commands, at 1 fan, and at 2 there is TV. So the first button that I pushed was 2, so TV turned on, and the second button that I pushed was 0, the light turned on, that is correct. And lastly I pressed the 1 button, and yeah, fan speed set to medium. And at the end I pressed the undo button, so this should revert the operation of the fan, right? So yeah, it does what it says. So fan was turned off by pressing this undo button. You can visualize this command pattern with this diagram. There is a receiver that can perform some action, and we are encapsulating it with a common command interface, and the execute function of which calls the action on the receiver. So we are encapsulating the request here. So this is a quick summary of the command pattern. So command declares an interface for all commands. It has an execute and undo method. The execute method of a concrete command eventually calls the action of the receiver. The client is responsible for creating a concrete command and setting its receiver. In our case, it was the remote loader. The invoker holds a command and at some point asks the command to call its execute method. The invoker here was the common remote that we had. The receiver knows how to perform the work needed to carry out the request. And lastly, the invoker of the request and the receiver of the request are decoupled.